Hi everyone. I want to talk a bit about the G7 as it currently stands. Not so much about the specific recent summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, seventh summit to be held in Canada, and I believe it's been held at that destination before. Not so much about that specific meeting, although I'll have a little bit of commentary about it, but more about the G7 in general and its relevance in the world today. Um, So one thing that stood out about this G7 is, I'll just say this in passing, is it was the first one for several of the leaders involved. Um, Apart from Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron, all the leaders are relatively new in their office. Well, I suppose Giorgia Meloni is the next most senior leader in terms of tenure. She came into office in 2022. But if we look at the others, Keir Starmer, 2024, Shigeru Ishiba of Japan, 2024, and this year, Mark Carney, the host, and Friedrich Merz of Germany. Um, so most of these are relatively new, as has been in the convention with G7s in recent years. There has also been EU representation, Antonio Costa and Ursula von der Leyen. Now I'll come to the summit in a minute. A little bit of history about the G7 first of all. Um, this was the 51st G7 summit. It goes back to the mid 1970s. It initially started off as a meeting of finance ministers in 1973, and the first formal summit. It was initially the G6, and then I think the United States joined afterwards, or uh, another country joined, but it was initially the G6. Um, the first meeting of the G7 was held in France. I think it was at Versailles actually, 1975, and the leaders involved in that meeting were Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, President d'Estaing of France, who was host, Helmut Schmidt of Germany, Aldo Moro of Italy, um, Takeo Miki of Japan, Harold Wilson of Britain, and Gerald Ford of the United States. That was the first G7 summit. In 1994, there was a significant development. The summit that year was held in Naples, and it was agreed that it was time for the detente with Russia. And on the invitation of Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, Boris Yeltsin was invited to join the subsequent G7s, which then became the G8. That lasted for about a decade. Then we had the events of 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, and David Cameron announced that the scheduled G8 for that year, which would have been held in Sochi, Russia, which was actually the same year that city was hosting the Winter Olympics. David Cameron announced that it would be held by the EU instead in Brussels. That was a significant development. The G8 became the G7 in from 2014 onwards. So that means that the last G8 in which Russia was involved, Putin was invited, was the 2013 G8, which was held at Lochburn in Northern Ireland. Um, I think it's fair to say the peak of the G8 was about the late 2000s. The big one I remember is the G8 in 2005 at Gleneagles in Scotland. The reason I remember that is because that was a very busy week. The big Live 8 concerts was being held around the world. I was actually at Live 8 in London, the biggest pop concerts ever held, in conjunction with Make Poverty History. There was also the London bombings that week, and there was the 60th anniversary commemoration to World War II. So it was a very, very busy week. And London was also announced as the winner of the 2012 Olympics. So it was a very busy week. Um, and I remember Tony Blair addressing the world. Say what you want about Tony Blair, but I think he had statesmanship and he addressed the world in light of the terrorist attacks in London with the other leaders behind him. Um, Also in the 2005 summit, Tony Blair and the other leaders proposed the G8 plus five. Now, bear in mind, 2005 Russia was still in it. The plus five included Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and South Africa. Um, After the Great Recession, the 2008 financial crash, it's fair to say the G8 started to decline in significance. And then, of course, it became the G7 in 2014. And then we saw the emergence of the G20. I remember the London summit in 2009, hosted by Gordon Brown. It was a big, big event and controversial because of the death of a man who was caught up in protests. He was not actually protesting himself, but he was caught up in the protests, and that brought attention to the police's controversial kettling tactics. Usually, G7 summits, by their very nature, attract protests. There didn't seem to be really big protests at this one in Canada. Um, Now, before I get into the wider subject of the G7, I'll just mention a few things about this summit in Canada. Like I say, it was the first summit for several of the leaders, including Mark Carney, the new Canadian Prime Minister. I have to say I'm impressed by Carney. For me, he is the standout leader of the G7 at the moment. He's the one that has really stood up to Donald Trump, without, throwing fire unnecessarily, but he has stood up to Trump. He's been consistent support for Ukraine. I'm impressed by him so far. Um, and he's abundant experience. He was governor of the Bank of England. I'm just going to read out a little piece from the Times. It shows Donald Trump walking away from a helicopter. Um, and this is outrageous. It just shows what, in contrast, what an utter lack of statesmanship Trump has. He actually is still defending Russia. Disgraceful. President Trump said it was a mistake to eject Russia from the G8 and that Vladimir Putin was right to feel insulted at his treatment by the club of the world's richest democracies. US President claimed there would not have been a war in Ukraine if the other nations had kept Russia inside their high level forum, now the G7. The G7 used to be the G8. Barack Obama and a person named Trudeau didn't want to have Russia in, and I would say that was a mistake, he said at a welcome ceremony with Mark Carney, Justin Trudeau's successor as Canadian Prime Minister. Trump and Putin was very insulted when he got thrown out of the G8, adding, "As I would be, as anyone would be." Asked if he wanted Putin to have a seat at the G7, he replied, "I don't think he should at this point because too much water's gone over the dam, maybe." Its criticism did not bode well for anticipated bilateral meeting today between Trump and President Zelensky. European nations are hoping to persuade Trump to support tougher sanctions on Moscow to end the fighting in Ukraine. Zelensky was invited to the meeting. This is another thing you often see with G7s. I'm pleased to say the Ukrainian Canadian community gave a big welcome sign to Zelensky, and other leaders greeted him warmly. Um, Aside from Pope Francis's funeral, there's no question that relations have been strained between Trump and Zelensky, um, largely on the part of Donald Trump, it has to be said. I was utterly disgusted by the way Trump and Rubio and Vance, and that so-called journalist treated President Zelensky at a meeting in the White House. It was nothing but gaslighting, condescending, absolutely disgraceful scenes. Um, and I think Trump doesn't like Zelensky on a personal basis. Um, this feeds into those conspiracy theorists and others who think that Zelensky is just after American money. But the important thing to consider, if that's the case, you'd think Zelensky would be off jet setting and enjoying skiing holidays and living up in mansions. He's not. He's doing absolutely everything he can to defend his country from a larger aggressive neighbor. And once again, we see Trump's ignorance in foreign affairs. He forgets why Russia was thrown out of the G7, out of the G8, as it then was. It didn't just happen out of thin air. It happened because of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and Russian aggression towards Ukraine. That's why it happened. There's also other contexts going on. Russia's increasing espionage belligerence towards the West, including what happened with Alexander Litvinenko in the UK. There was a long string of things going on, which showed that Russia could not be trusted. Russia was thrown out of the G8 entirely of its own making. And this is the point. The fact that Boris Yeltsin had been invited into the G8, the fact that Clinton and Blair and other leaders had said, okay, let's treat Russia as an equal, showed there was goodwill on the part of the West. You know, pro Russia propagandists always create this narrative whereby Russia's felt humiliated, Russia has felt pushed out, Russia has not been respected. How do they explain the fact that Russia was indeed a member of the G8? If Russia wasn't respected, why was it a member of the G8? And there's a point with that actually. There's countries that are far more deserving to be in the would-be G8 than Russia. I mean, if we're going by the world's biggest economies, Russia doesn't rank 8th. I think at present it ranks 12th or 13th. Australia and South Korea arguably have a bigger claim to be in the G8, would be G8. I would argue Spain does. If it comes to it, I would argue Ukraine does, although economically it's going to be much further down the list. But morally, it certainly deserves to have a bigger seat at the table. I mean, Ukraine has had problems with corruption, but it is more democratic than Russia. In the time that Putin's been autocrat of Russia, dictator of Russia, Ukraine's had about 4 or 5 presidents. So that's pretty obvious which country is more democratic. Um, but I do think if the G7 is to remain relevant, um, it's true that at every meeting, other leaders are invited as sort of observers. Narendra Modi of India, Lula da Silva of Brazil, Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa. But I think it's maybe time to look at inviting countries like South Korea and Australia, democracies, wealthy countries. Um, in especially in the case of South Korea, I think that would be significant because one criticism of the G7 has long been it's kind of a Western club with the exception of Japan. So inviting South Korea, an Asian country, will counter that somewhat. Um, I certainly think there should be closer cooperation with countries like Mexico. Um, India, I'm not sure about because India tends to play double games. It's still very cozy with Russia. And the sort of media narratives you see in India tend to be very hostile to the West. If you look at the likes of We On News, it's constantly berating the West and particularly the UK. So I'm not entirely sure about India. I believe in working closely with India, but in terms of treating it as a full partner, trust and respect goes both ways. Looking around the world, there's probably other countries that are present in the G20 that could perhaps um, be considered to be in a potential G8 or G9. It would further polarize Russia, which I think is a good thing. I think Russia needs to be polarized. I would greatly welcome the downfall of Putin. I think so long as Putin is in power, he is a danger. Now, of course, as this has been going on, there's been a major crisis that has developed, which is not just tensions between Israel and Iran, but full-scale war. I will definitely be making a video specifically about that. Trump left the meeting early because of that. Um, Most leaders have come out in support of Israel. I'll be talking more in detail about that soon. Um, but I would say this, is the BRICS, for example, a threat to the G7? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa is a pretty formidable alliance. Those are five powerful countries. Within that, you have at least one superpower, China. So it's pretty formidable. But I don't actually think the BRICS are as big a threat as the West should fear. Why? Because for one thing, they're not united. I mean, on the surface, China and Russia will appear to agree, but China and India have had deadly border clashes. And if you look at those countries, they have serious internal tensions going on. South Africa has severe domestic problems. Brazil had a constitutional crisis in 2023. So these countries aren't exactly stable. For that reason, I don't think Russia is, by the way, not stable. Um, in terms of those five, I think the one the West needs to be most wary of in some ways is China. One risk about putting so much attention on Russia, and I think it's right that Russia is opposed. I think it's right that Putin is polarized as much as possible. But one thing that is important is not to lose sight of the threat from China. And when I'm looking at Keir Starmer's premiership coming up to the 1 year mark, one of the biggest mistakes, possibly the biggest mistake, is the pandering to China. The security services have warned Starmer's government about this. They don't seem to be listening. If that mega embassy goes ahead, it would be a complete disaster. It would be an invitation to create the biggest spy base in Western Europe. It would be absolutely foolish. And if there is any major sort of breach, it will be entirely on the watch of Starmer, Reeves, and Lamy, and they will have to answer to that. The security services warned them. The Chinese will do what they're going to do. It's a rogue regime; it cannot be trusted. Um, and I think that because of what's happened in Ukraine, understandably, there's a tension in Russia, but we should never lose sight of the fact that the entire world suffered because of China's lack of transparency over COVID. Now, we may never know exactly how that began, whether it was in a lab or whether it was in a wet market. We know it began in China, but exactly how we may never know for sure. But one thing is for sure, when whistleblowers warned the authorities about this, they were punished. I believe the Chinese regime could have contained that and made it a localized situation rather than allowing it to become a worldwide epidemic, pandemic, in which millions and millions died. The deadliest pandemic since, well, HIV is ongoing, but certainly the deadliest in that context since the Spanish flu of 1918. So, it seems that people have just kind of moved on from that. Oh, well, China's got away with it. I don't I think actually there would be a strong moral argument for economic sanctions on China. I think the mistake with China that too many countries make is it's just this big monolith that cannot be challenged. It's too scary. We better not provoke it. Kind of the same with Donald Trump's America. This idea we better not provoke Trump. Um, I'd like to see more Western countries getting a bit of a backbone and standing up, yes, to Donald Trump, but also to China. Um, so, going to wrap this up, but I wrote a few notes here, so if there's anything else I can mention. Passing, not really. It's true that the significance of the G7 has declined. It would be prudent to argue otherwise. It has clearly declined. It gets less media coverage. You still have the sort of family photo ops. Like I say, in this summit, a lot of new leaders. Who do we have? We have host Mark Carney, Donald Trump, Emmanuel Macron, um, Georgia Maloney, I was trying to remember her first name there, Georgia Maloney, Keir Starmer, Shigeru Ishiba, um, and the new German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. So he tends to stand out as a very tall man. I think he's one of the tallest world leaders for some time. There was also something about Macron and Maloney. He's whispered something to Maloney. There's often these little things at the side, like the time when George W. Bush shouted "Yo Blair" at one of the summits. I think it was at the I forget which one it was. So there's always those little side things. And there's a family photo op. The Times didn't even carry that photo, such as the limited coverage that the G7 now gets. The G20 is now the world's foremost global political summit. But is the G7 totally irrelevant? I wouldn't say it's totally irrelevant, but unless there's sort of decisive decisions, and the problem is with Donald Trump in the White House, Trump has done everything he can to weaken Western institutions. I think he's a disgraceful leader, and it's utterly delusional, by the way, to talk about bringing Russia back in or even talk about Russia being insulted. Donald Trump conveniently forgets why Russia was kicked out in the first place. And in the latest drone strikes, an American citizen was killed. Um, Trump has finally brought himself to condemn Putin on some level, but I think that's more because he feels personally let down rather than any sort of moral reasons over Ukraine. Um, Disgracefully, he said they should just fight it out like children when he was meeting with Friedrich Merz in the Oval Office recently. Fight it out like children. That's how he sees the situation. I think Donald Trump absolutely cannot be trusted, but unfortunately, he is American president, so he can't be ignored. But I think I'd like to see Western leaders stand up to Trump a bit more. And I do think one thing that's come out of the instability of Donald Trump is European leaders do need to step up. European nations need to step up. Um, there can be no ceasefire in Ukraine so long as Russia deliberately targets Ukrainian civilians in these acts of state terrorism. Ukraine, by contrast, targets specifically military installations in Russia. But it's grotesque to lecture the Ukrainians about peace when their civilians are being killed. Donald Trump has shown himself to be a complete and utter card when it comes to Russia and Putin. Um, the only thing that may be a silver lining to this is he kept promising his base he would end up ending this war on day one. That, of course, was nonsense. Donald Trump might finally be waking up to the reality that the biggest obstacle is Putin. That may mean that Trump turns against Putin, and it may be the only thing that forces this war to end. But I think the only way it ends is by a complete withdrawal of Russian forces. Um, right now, it's kind of like the G6 plus 1. You have 6 countries that want to stand up to Russia, and then Donald Trump, who cannot be trusted. And that's really a problem. So if the G7 has weakened, I would say it's two things. Um, it's the emergence of the G20 and Donald Trump. I'd say more so than the economic crisis of 2007, 2008, because I would argue Obama's stimulus package played a big role in recovery. I'm not convinced that was necessarily the benchmark for the end of significance. I think it was more about the emergence of other countries. Um, anyway, leave it there, but I don't think it's completely irrelevant, but it's definitely declined. Um, but I'm not overtly worried about the BRICS. And finally, the G7 has to stand up to Russia because what we're seeing is absolute state terrorism from Putin. Putin is a thug, he's a war criminal, and it's a disgrace that Donald Trump is repeating some of the narratives to justify Russian propaganda. Russia was kicked out of the G8 with very good reason. This idea that there'd be no war in Ukraine, I'm not convinced of that. I think what would have happened is Putin maybe would have removed himself from the G8. He would have invaded Ukraine regardless. I just don't believe that he would have been reined in. He would have been appeased. I think Putin was always going to invade Ukraine. I think that was always his long term agenda.